So if you guys remember from last class period, we talked about how the Indian Removal Act was created by Andrew Jackson in an attempt to get more land for those white settlers. So basically, he creates this idea that you should be able to move these people west in order to help those white settlers get that land. Now, in particular, this is important with Georgia because of all that cotton land that they wanted to be able to get. So if you want to put next to this at the major cause for why they justify, so a good justification for why they did this, is because they said that Native Americans could not live in harmony with white settlers. So again, the justification, Native Americans could not live in harmony with white settlers. So, what happens is that this Indian Removal Act is going to forcefully relocate them, and if you want to put this next to where they relocated from, they're mostly going to relocate from Georgia to Oklahoma. So again, their major areas of relocation is Georgia to Oklahoma. Now, in terms of the justification for this, I'm just warning you, it's going to be very, very racist, what we're about to read. So if you notice, this is going to be a letter of why we should begin to do this. So if you notice, it says, but it will prove in the end an act of enlarged philanthropy, these untutored sons of the forest. So you guys notice how they're saying that untutored sons of the forest? This idea that you are less civilized, you are less sophisticated than us, cannot exist in a state of independence in the vicinity of the white man. So basically they're saying that you cannot coincide and live together with Native Americans and people who are white. So the only solution of that is to move the Native Americans to a new location. So this is another justification. So it says, I was satisfied that the Indians could not possibly live under the laws of the state. It's the same thing we said before. And then notice it says, I feel conscious of having done my duty to my red children. This idea that basically these Native Americans, this philanthropy of helping them out and saving them from these white settlements is the only solution. Now, the Native Americans, though, are not too happy about this. So they are going to sue for the ability to not get moved. Now, I would star this on your paper. This is known as Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. And this is going to be the Supreme Court lawsuit that they are going to say that you are violating our rights. Now, what happens is that during this lawsuit, they are going to say that we are an independent nation, and that because we're an independent nation, you have also violated our individual rights. So what happens is that basically it goes in front of the Supreme Court, and surprisingly enough, they side with the Native Americans. They said your rights have been violated, and this is not okay. How do you think Andrew Jackson reacts to that decision? Knowing what we know about Andrew Jackson, how he's going to react when somebody says he's wrong? He's not going to like it. In fact, he goes in front and he ends up saying, John Marshall has made this decision, now let him enforce it. So I want you to imagine, for example, somebody comes in here and says, hey, you're suspended. And you sit there and you say, well, what are you going to do about it? That's basically what Andrew Jackson says. So instead, he disagrees with the Supreme Court and he does whatever he wants. Imagine if our own presidency now took a Supreme Court decision and said, try to enforce it, and does something else anyways. So what happens is the mass migration. Now, this is what is known as the Trail of Tears. I would go ahead and star that Trail of Tears. This went viral, by the way, a couple years ago. So if it sounds familiar, it was actually a viral thing that went online about the Trail of Tears. So basically, the Trail of Tears is this mass forced migration of the natives, especially the Cherokee. So make sure you know, especially the Cherokee are going to move in particular from Georgia to Oklahoma. Now, I'm going to read you this. This is an example of a primary source of what it was like during that time. So it says, at the end of 1831, I stood on the left bank of the Mississippi. It was then the depths of winter and the cold was exceptionally severe. The snow had frozen hard on the ground. The river was drifting with huge ice floes. The Indians had brought their families with them and hauled along the wounded, the sick, newborn babies, and old men on the verge of death. They had neither tents nor wagons. I saw them embarked across the wide river. That solemn spectacle will never be erased from my memory. Not a sob or complaint can be heard. They stood silent. Their afflictions were of long standing, and they considered them beyond remedy. Already the Indians had all embarked upon the boat which was to carry them. Their dogs still remained upon the bank. When these animals finally saw that they were being left behind forever, they raised all together in a terrible howl and plunged into the icy Mississippi to swim to their masters. Now these people were forced to walk approximately, if you were a Cherokee, about 800 miles. There's no wagons. There are no horses. All there is this movement west. And this was in the dead of winter. So when we talk about death counts, it's really high, in particular with the Cherokee. So the Cherokee, if you notice, are going to have about 20,000 tribal members get removed, and up to 8,000 of them are going to die. And you might say, well, how do we know this huge, broad number? It's because they didn't bury their dead. When people died, they couldn't stop. They weren't allowed to stop. So oftentimes they would wake up, see somebody dead, and they would just move on. So a lot of the dead bodies they're unable to count because they get eaten by animals and different things like that. But you can see why we focus on the Cherokee the most, because they lost up to possibly a third almost of their people during this march. Now this begins the massive forced migration of the Native Americans and begins to move them into smaller territory. So we'll talk about later the restrictions, but this really begins the first major restriction of the natives and the start of that reservation system. Now, today's reservation system, which again does not start here, but we're just talking about restrictions of the natives. This is our current modern day reservation system. If you notice, we really have two here, the Ute tribe as well as the Navajos. This is Ute and Navajo down below. But again, beginning that mass restriction of those natives. So when you look at an image like this is one of the ones that you tend to see about Andrew Jackson. So if you guys remember that part where we said, where it's called basically where he talks about like, I'm keeping those red children and I'm helping them. That's what this is showing, almost like dolls and keeping them safe. And so what happens is basically this Andrew Jackson thing all about these Native Americans and this Trail of Tears. If you're keeping a list, which a lot of students found helpful, of the 3 most controversial things about Andrew Jackson, number 1 is that Indian removal. Was he in that right? Was he wrong? Did he have a right to be able to do this or not? That was a huge thing that ended up happening because of that. Okay, so in terms of the second major crisis that happens, it's going to be the national bank. So this is what's known for number 2 as the Bank War. So the Bank War is going to happen with the second national bank. So the first national bank goes away after the War of 1812. However, the economy is still unstable, and so instead, they decide that they are going to create this brand new national bank. Now, I would highlight on here, helped stabilize the economy after the War of 1812. Now, the reason why is because we needed a stable economy. Without a national bank, we were beginning to crumble. But again, all the controversies of the past come up. Is this constitutional or not? Is this only helping the elite bankers? Is this only helping the North? And also, we have an economic downturn a couple of years later. So the national bank was always a bit controversial. Now, if you remember in the election of 1832, this is Henry Clay's second attempt at winning the presidency, and unfortunately, he loses again. Bummer, I know. So Henry Clay loses again to Andrew Jackson, but luckily for him, he has an asset. You see, this guy named Nicholas Biddle was one of his really good friends, and Biddle becomes the head of the National Bank. And Biddle is basically a Whig, so it's perfect for him because now he's able to basically create this national bank that's in the image of Henry Clay. Well, Henry Clay and Biddle come up with this great national bank. It helps the American system, it helps the commerce, and it helps the North. However, Andrew Jackson hates it. Andrew Jackson feels like this only benefits the North. Andrew Jackson feels like the South is getting nothing. Andrew Jackson feels like the Southern cotton planters are not being helped in any way. And so he decides that he wants to get rid of the bank. And at a dinner party with Martin Van Buren, he actually ends up saying, the bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. So he wants to get rid of the bank in any way that he can. But there's a problem. You can't just kill the national bank. You can't just say, I'm not going to have it anymore. That's like saying I'm no longer going to have the American Treasury. So he has to figure out a way to no longer have a national bank, but basically make sure he does it legally. So here's what he is going to end up doing. So Andrew Jackson wants to get rid of the bank. He decides to go to war with Nicholas Biddle. Well, Nicholas Biddle is not going to back down. He says we need a national bank and we're going to keep it going. So instead, he knows that he needs to cut off the head of the national bank. So that's what this is showing, is that each of these heads is a supporter of the national bank. Andrew Jackson is going to come along and he is going to kill that national bank. Well, what he does is he replaces Biddle with a guy named Roger B. Taney, who basically looks like death in my opinion. Okay? Now, Roger B. Taney is going to take over the national bank, and he's going to do something extremely creative. You see, what he does is instead of putting money into the bank, he's going to begin to put it elsewhere. So imagine trillions of dollars of our national treasury in a bank, and we keep taking money from it, but now all of our deposits are going into this other, more private bank. Now I want you to pretend you're a big person grown up, okay? And you have a bank account. And you have this wonderful debit card that you love to swipe, 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 but you aren't putting any money into it. What's eventually going to happen when you go to swipe that card? You're spending money, but not putting it into the bank. It's going to decline. Well, what happened is your bank doesn't like you anymore. They don't want you anymore. So they end up declining your card and they close your account. So what they do here is they stop putting money into the national bank. They put it into a private bank. And then keep spending money into the national bank until eventually it goes bankrupt. Nobody's able to still perform their jobs because there's no money anymore, and the bank closes. He kills the national bank through creativity, basically. So the second biggest controversy is this bank war. Should Jackson have gotten rid of the bank? And the biggest negative that happens from this bank war, which by the way is just showing that these are all the devils of the national bank that he's going to end up stopping. Well, the biggest effect is going to be a panic. Now, we talk about economic downturns. A depression is big. If you think about the Great Depression, that was like a 15-year time period approximately, where several people lost their jobs, suicide rates were an all-right high, people had no money, but that lasted over 15 years. That's called a depression. A recession is a shorter amount of time. So we had a recession between 2008 and about 2013 or so, about 5 years. Since that's a shorter amount of time, it's a recession, and I hope really much so that if your parents were affected by the recession, you didn't feel it or you don't remember it. Because for a lot of people, those 5 years, it kills them. But it's a shorter amount of time. That's why it's called a recession, not a depression. Then you have a panic. So a panic occurs right after the national bank closes, where for 1 year, the economy absolutely plummets. Now, if you notice in this cartoon, it's actually much sadder if you read what they say. So over here on the left, he says, I have no money and cannot get any work. And then over here, his kid's like, I'm so hungry. And then this little girl's like, can I please have a loaf of bread? And this mom is like, do you have any money to help feed the baby? And meanwhile, this guy's coming in and saying, I'm going to come and foreclose your home. That's what life was like. The national bank closes and the economy absolutely plummets. So if you want to put a major effect of the bank closing, the panic of 1837, the economy plummets. Now, luckily for Jackson, this does not get blamed on Andrew Jackson. This gets blamed solely on Martin Van Buren because he was the president. Back then, people didn't connect that, the national bank caused this. They blamed it on Van Buren, and then eventually they're like, oh, shoot, it's Jackson too. Which is part of the reason why they don't elect somebody in the next presidency. Who's a Democrat, I should say. Now, in terms of Taney gets appointed for this glory of closing the national bank. And he's going to get appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. However, we're going to talk about him later. In a couple of weeks, I will talk about him. He makes one of the worst Supreme Court case decisions in American history that continues to affect you guys today. And I'm going to say, do you remember Roger B. Taney? And most of you are going to say no, but I'm hoping one day somebody will say yes and tell me why we remember him. So hopefully you remember him in a couple of weeks when I bring him up again. We'll see. And then we get to the third controversy, which is going to be what's called the nullification crisis. So again, number 3 is the nullification crisis. This, by the way, is all from our notes that we've been working on the last 3 class periods. So, what happens with the nullification crisis? So first off, we have the American system. Who did the American system? Let's see if you guys remember. What's the term? What's the guy? Henry Clay. Henry Clay believes in the American system, the internal improvements in the United States. Well, the thing is that this American system was controversial. What area of the country does the American system benefit? The North. So how do you think the South feels about it? Angry, frustrated, they hate it. And the other problem is that the South keeps getting hit with more and more terrible laws. In particular, if you will highlight what is known as the Tariff of Abominations. The Tariff of Abominations. Now, do you guys remember we've talked about a tariff in the past? Who does a tariff tend to benefit? What area of the country? The North. And what type of profession? The bankers, the merchants, which basically tends to benefit the Federalists and then the Whigs later on. So basically the tariff gets enacted and the Southern Democrats are angry. They don't like this, they don't want it, and in particular, if you want to put next to the Tariff of Abominations, hurts the Southern cotton planters. While the Northern factories benefit from this, the Southern cotton planters do not. It's the same reason why today a lot of our steel manufacturers in America, as well as our wheat, struggle with the current tariff war with China because it hurts them. And so what happens is that the South gets angry because they're not making as much money. Well, what happens is that this guy is going to come along. Now, if you think in your head, man, Henry Clay, he was attractive. And then you respond to that and say, Roger B. Taney, whoo, that gets my heart all aflutter. I'm going to introduce you to a new guy who I think you should blow up and put onto your ceiling so you can watch him as you fall asleep because he is so dang attractive. And that moon is, in a second, if the button presses, John C. Calhoun. Now, yes, does he look electrified? Yes. I also want you to notice his beautiful neck beard. That is a beard. Okay. I know, hot. Okay. Now, John C. Calhoun, who we always typically call him Crazy Calhoun because we're going to hear about him for the next 20 years in the Civil War and stuff like that. And, I mean, he does some insane, crazy stuff. John C. Calhoun is in South Carolina. And he doesn't like this. You see, South Carolina is getting really hit hard by this tariff. And he's angry. And he, as a senator, says that something needs to happen. And in particular, his concern is, why does the federal government have so much power? Why isn't it helping the little guy farmer? And so what happens is that, as all good things do, following the tariff, they are going to have a dinner party. And John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson have this beautiful little dinner party where basically you have all these people angry about this tariff. And they get together, and Andrew Jackson decides that he is going to be all grand and valor. So he holds his cup up in the air, and he clinks, 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 and he does a little toast. And in that toast, he's going to say, our union, it must be preserved. Everyone's, oh, golf clap, yay, union, whatever. And then John C. Calhoun stands up without permission, responds, holds his wine cup up in the air, and says, the union next to our liberty, the most dear, may we always remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states. And then he sits down and chugs his glass of wine, slams it onto the desk, and waits for his response. He believed 100% the federal government was overreaching their boundaries and was not helping the little guy. But don't worry, John C. Calhoun has a great idea. You see, in his mind, I signed the U.S. Constitution, or not him, but basically the states. If a state signs the Constitution, why can't you then say it is against the law? So this is what he's going to say. This is what's called nullification, and you need to know the word nullification. During the nullification crisis, John C. Calhoun says, a state can declare a federal law void or unconstitutional if it sees fit because it signed the Constitution. So I want you to think of an example. Right now in America, we have a whole bunch of debates going on about abortion. Back in the 70s, we'll learn about this later, there was a thing called Roe v. Wade, which said you cannot full-on ban abortion in the United States. Well, several conservative states still want to ban abortion. So what they do is they do a little workaround, and they basically ban abortion without banning abortion. So let me explain how that works. These are what are called heartbeat laws, are the most famous ones that are examples. So a heartbeat law is a law that says that as soon as you can feel a fetal heartbeat, you can no longer have an abortion. So most fetal heartbeats can be heard at 6 weeks of pregnancy, Most women don't find out they're pregnant until they're 7 or 8 weeks pregnant. So it basically bans abortion without banning abortion. Does that make sense? So, and by the way, about 8 states passed these laws last year. 2 days ago, they were found to be unconstitutional. So they were struck down 2 days ago by district courts down in the South. Well, here's the problem. If nullification is true then, what if Utah decides, you know what, we don't agree with Roe v. Wade, that's unconstitutional, and we're going to ban it here in America, or here in Utah. Can you do that as the state of Utah? No. It's unconstitutional. So what happens in this case is that he is going to declare this law void. Well, the problem is you can't actually do that. So John C. Calhoun declares this law null and void. You cannot have this tariff. How do you think that made Andrew Jackson feel? Pretty ticked off. So he responds by sending about 10,000 troops down to South Carolina. It quells the rebellion because you see what happened is South Carolina seceded from the Union. Hey, if you're leaving, will you hurry real quick? Because you're being a little bit loud. Do you have a no? Oh, you're in debate. Okay. So what happens is that basically South Carolina secedes from the Union. They write up a document. They say we're leaving because of this tariff. Jackson sends all these troops. It stops the rebellion. But who do you think is going to come in and save everybody's day? Henry Clay. Henry Clay, our great savior, comes in, creates a brand new tariff that benefits both the North and the South. This is our next Band-Aid of Henry Clay. This is his second Band-Aid. And he saves the day. But really what this shows with the nullification is this is the third biggest controversy is whether or not a state can do this or not. Okay? So from there, what is Andrew Jackson? Who is Andrew Jackson? It kind of depends on your own perception. Now I will tell you that if you Google political cartoons of Andrew Jackson, you hardly find any positive ones. He was extremely controversial during his day and especially up until now. Now if you notice with this image always gets misunderstood. So you can see it says King Andrew I, and I always get people right that it says that Andrew Jackson is the greatest, and that's why they're portraying him this way, is because being a king is great. In America, right after the Revolution, if they call you a king, is that a positive thing in America? No. In today's world, I see memes all the time that put Donald Trump as a king. Is that supposed to be a positive meme? No, it's not. So when somebody in America portrays somebody else as a king or a monarch, that's a bad thing, okay? At least that's the person's perception of that. So that brings us to our new notes. Go ahead and flip to your new notes. So now what we're going to be going into is expansion. Now if you want to put at the top of this, no for the Civil War. So at the top of this, no for the Civil War. A lot of this can be used in a Civil War essay and also could be also historical context depending on the essay and the time period of your essay. So we're going to start today by talking about the expansion of America. And we have to go back to right after the War of 1812. So following the War of 1812, we've acquired a whole bunch of land. All this land up until the red is acquired in this war. The only part other than this over here that we don't have is going to be all this. So this is going to be over here for right now. And then all of this land right down here. And so we want to finish up our acquirement of the southern United States. There's a problem. It's owned at this point by Spain. Now Andrew Jackson, our savior of the War of 1812, remember Battle of New Orleans, he fights in that Creek War down in the south. He continues that fighting against what's called the Seminole Indians, so the Seminole tribes, down on the border of Florida. Now this is against Spain as well as the Native Americans. So make sure you know for this Spain. Make sure you know that we get this from Spain. So we are going to acquire in a couple years Spain. And I always hear, well, why did we acquire Spain? Why did we ever get that? Well, the reason why we acquire Spain is because Spain is at this point pretty much done with colonizing. They don't want to be colonizers anymore. Now, if you are an AP World or AP Euro person, you have a little bit of a leg up from everybody else because you know what's going on in their colonies at this time. So in Central and South America during the 1800s, Spain is attempting to keep their colonies the best that they can. They want to be these world powers, but the problem is, after the American Revolution, everybody's rebelling. They lose Haiti. They lose the Dominican Republic. All these things that are going on in the Caribbean. This map on the right is showing you by color when these states when these areas gained their independence. And if you notice in our time period, 1810 to 1820, that's a whole bunch of countries that Spain is beginning to lose. So when we talk about Florida, Florida was just another thorn in their side. And it didn't really have that many resources. South America in particular had a whole bunch of silver that they wanted to be able to keep. So Spain decides to get rid of Florida to focus on the other colonies, which obviously, as you can see, by really about 1899, they lose basically everything of their colonies. So what happens is that we acquire Florida, which is going to be this piece down here, what is known as the Adams-Onis Treaty, which if you will highlight that term, we're going to acquire this in the Adams-Onis Treaty. And then we're going to end up wanting to think about our borders a little bit more. You see, after this, we want to decide whether or not we want to allow Europeans to interfere with the affairs in the United States as well as the rest of America. And so we passed what is known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is an extremely important term. This is like a 2-star term. If you will also put next to this historical context. And if you want to put next to this historical context, imperialism. And imperialism and World War I. Those are the most common essays that you could use this as a historical context for. So what the Monroe Doctrine basically did is it banned all of Europe from interfering with American affairs. So when we talk about this interference of American affairs, we're talking about Europe is completely off limits from the Americas. Now, I always hear a lot of times, how can we enforce that? How can we just tell another country you're no longer allowed to be part of the Americas? Well, first, we ban this by basically saying we're going to send in troops, and at this time, so many countries are losing territories left and right that they don't have this ability to begin to fight. And then second, when they do decide to start fighting for the territories, we come back and we're going to fight them. That's when we get to the imperialism of the late 1800s. So we banned this European colonization from coming over into the Americas through this doctrine. Now, we're going to learn about this a ton more in about 1.5 months, okay, in January. Do you have a question? Yeah, so that's imperialism. Yeah, so on a Spanish-American War essay, which was actually, and if you don't know what that is, don't worry, you'll learn it in a month and a half. That was the DBQ a couple of years ago, and almost everybody used this as their historical context on their essay. So yeah, good one. So what happens is basically they've said that there is no longer American imperialism. And one thing I want to point out though, what about America? Did we ban ourselves from imperializing and taking over? No. So we banned everybody else but us. Okay? So that brings us to manifest destiny, which out of all the terms in American history, there's like certain terms like abolition, manifest destiny. Those are terms that are no matter what going to be on the AP exam. At least 2 stimulus sets will most likely be on manifest destiny at some point. And last year, 2 of the essays were also on manifest destiny. So no matter what, it's going to be on there. And this actually affects us today. So I would do like 3-4 stars, must know. You're going to memorize this term. Trust me, it's a very important one. And if you will highlight John O'Sullivan. So John O'Sullivan's going to be the guy that creates this in a magazine. And he writes this idea about basically why we're allowed to expand west. So first off, if you want to put number 1, the expansion of white Americans. So we are going to begin to expand as white Americans across the continent because 2, it was inevitable. No matter what, we were going to move west, and that's just the way it's going to be. Because 3, we were ordained by God to do it. Now, in the past, we talked about a time when we felt we were ordained by God to do something. Do you guys remember what that term was? Puritan America? City upon a hill. So if you want to put next to manifest destiny, city upon a hill, that's the same idea. Where we are an example in the light of the world. So we felt with manifest destiny, God preordained us to move west and move into other places and other countries. In order to, 3, spread Protestant Christianity, definitely not Catholicism. And 4 is to spread Jacksonian democracy. Now, if you want to put underneath Jacksonian democracy of what it is, Jacksonian democracy is democracy for all. We talked about in the past how white property owners no longer have the exclusive right to vote. Everybody who is white and male now have the rights to be able to vote in America. And because of that, they like that common man. Everybody has an impact. So we're going to spread this idea to other people. So if you ever hear in a war where we say something along the lines of, so-and-so's country doesn't have a freedom of whatever, so-and-so's country doesn't have a democracy, like our current war system that we go into right now, that's part of this manifest destiny idea to spread democracy across the world. Okay? And we do this by what's called highlighting annexing. When you annex something, you are saying that it's part of your country without war and without treaty. So let's pretend, for example, that Donald Trump tomorrow goes in front of the TV and says, by the way, Australia, you are now the 51st state of the United States. Congratulations. That's annexing. Annexing means that we can take another territory or country and make it our own. When we get into imperialism in the late 1800s, we're going to realize we annexed about 15 countries and said that they were our own. And we're about to acquire one in just a second. Now, when we talk about this manifest destiny of this movement west, anytime you see movement west, these bright, shiny colors, that's all what it's in reference to. Now, in terms of the pros of manifest destiny, first off, finding natural resources. We want to be able to find more goods and more land for cotton planting as we begin to move west. Also, if you want to do what the second bullet is starring that one, is workers. More land, more working opportunity, less unemployment in the United States. Then, the fourth bullet, I would star that one as well. We will also, as we begin to expand, we prevent Spanish Catholics from taking over. Land speculators love it because they can now begin to exploit that new land, and most importantly, highlight the Democrats. And the reason why Democrats want more land, 1, more land for farming and agriculture. 2, slavery can now begin to expand. You have more land for cotton. So again, the reason why the Democrats support westward expansion is going to be 1, more land for agriculture, farmers, and 2, cotton, and slavery as a whole. On the opposite side, why don't we like manifest destiny? The most popular one you're going to see is the second bullet starring as abolition. If you begin to acquire more territory, you're just going to bring more and more opportunities for slavery. The other problem is representation. Why are we so concerned about representation? What's the term? 3/5 compromise. Okay? We're scared that 3/5 compromise will make an unequal balance in Congress. And then this is going to be highlighting supported by the Whigs. And the reason why is going to be because of internal improvements. We want to be able to improve internally and not through expansion. Which brings us to Texas. Now, Texas is going to be the first major state that or the first real country that we're going to move into. And Texas was originally Mexico. So you can't think of Texas as Texas because it doesn't exist at this time. It's Mexico. Okay? Now, the reason why we begin to move into Mexico is because following that Adams-Honest Treaty, we are right on the border of Texas. Now, with this next section of causes of the war, I would star this section because the most likely LEQ that you're going to see is a causation essay on Mexican-American War. And they haven't done one in about 30 years, so I think it's time possibly for another one to come up. So basically what happens is we're right along that border, and we see across that river the perfect opportunity for slavery and cotton to be able to grow. So reasons why we begin to move into Texas is number 1, lax immigration policy. So you need to know the 2 reasons why we move into Mexico, into Texas, in Mexico. Lax immigration policies. And 2, slavery. Perfect opportunity for growing cotton. Now, Stephen Austin has a thing called an impresario. That's how you get land. He creates the very first land colony called the Austin Colony and begins to rapidly spread Americans coming into that Texas colony. Now, what happens is that this begins to create a new ethnicity, basically, which is a mix between white American and Mexican bloodlines. It's called a Tejano. If you go to Mexico today, people of this bloodline tend to be heavily discriminated against because of this incident that ended up happening. But Texas begins to become very, very, very American. Now, that's why this ends up getting written. So you can see it says a person may travel all day and day after day and find Americans only. It becomes really an American colony. Well, what happens is Mexico decides that they are going to tighten that control. And they pass laws that begin to heavily restrict the Texans. And Texans begin to feel heavily threatened by these restrictions. So what's going to happen, there it is that they are going to, if you want to highlight increasing central authority, they begin to really heighten that authority over the Texans. And the Texans feel like they are being way too heavily restricted and that this is unfair to them. So Stephen Austin says war is the only option, and we are now going to begin what's called the Texas Revolution. So the Texas Revolution would be a good historical context for a Mexican-American War essay. It is not the same event. So again, Texas Revolution is a good historical context. Now, as they begin to fight, which, by the way, on that very first line, if you notice where it says this is a war on, make sure you know it's a war on race, which is both skin color and religion of Catholic versus Protestant, and also slavery. Should we have slavery in this territory? Well, what happens is that we're going to begin to fight. So several Texans are going to take over a Catholic mission. What mission is that? The Alamo, right? So it's in San Antonio, Texas, by the way. So they're going to take over the Alamo, and they say, we are the Texans, we're going to fight, and we're going to take over everything and become our own independent nation. Well, what happens at the Alamo is that they're going to have several important leaders that also go to defend that Alamo. James Bowie in particular, David Crockett, so if you ever heard of David Crockett, and then also William Travis, who's going to be a head general, they all go to defend the Alamo. But if you know anything about the Alamo, what happens at the Alamo? They all die. What happens is Santa Anna shows up with thousands and thousands of troops to fight 200 men, and over the next hour or so, all the Americans get slaughtered. Nobody survives the Alamo. Okay? The only reason we know what happened at the Alamo are multiple accounts from various sources that corroborate each other. So what happens is this massive fight begins, but we begin to have several heroes that come out of it. So, for example, you have Davy Crockett. So if you've ever been to Disneyland, by the way, you've heard the Davy Crockett song. You might have watched the Davy Crockett movie. He's really, really famous. He ends up being the last survivor, and they told him you could survive as long as you stop this rebellion. However, he says, I will not stop this rebellion. It's for the Texans. So he has the famous last words of, I'm warning you boys, I'm a screamer. Instead of shooting him, they fix bayonets, and 9 of them stab him to death with bayonets. Now, the other famous person that comes out of this is a guy named Jim Bowie. Now, Jim Bowie is going to try to defend himself. So what happens is he begins to shoot, but unfortunately his gun jams. But luckily for him, he has this trusted knife that he begins to kill 200 of the other men around him in only the space of 5 minutes. And ends up dying as a hero with his knife. What is that knife called today? A Bowie knife, and it becomes famous because of the Alamo. So if you go to the store today, you can actually buy Bowie knives now. That's what they look like, is it has this like moon-shaped thing that he created. It's also interesting because all the Bowie knives are about 6 inches long. That's because in most states, you can have knives fixed blade that are exactly 6 inches long. So I see people walk around with giant Bowie knives, and instead of having like a gun on them, they have a giant Bowie knife that they walk around. So if you ever see a sleeve that has a knife in it, it's probably a Bowie knife. Okay? Now from this, Jim Bowie becomes extremely famous. They actually created a comic strip of him that made him super famous. So while the Alamo was a disaster for the Americans, what you need to know for the Alamo is, if you will highlight, it showed the brutality of Santa Anna. It showed that the Mexicans were willing to do whatever they could to slaughter the Americans. Now next comes the Goliad. Now at Goliad, what basically happens is that Americans begin to fight, and again, they get destroyed. But this time, they're going to surrender. So all these men, hundreds of men, put their hands up. They say, we surrender. We're not going to fight anymore. They begin to march them to their POW camps, so their prisoner of war camp. But right outside the city limits, they kill 600 men in the space of only about an hour with shots. So again, the brutality of war. These men who had surrendered were all killed. So at this point, America begins to come back, and they are going to end up coming back at what's called the Battle of San Jacinto. And this is by Sam Houston, so again, Houston, Texas. And this becomes a massive American victory that results in, what you need to highlight, Santa Anna's surrender. So Santa Anna surrenders at this, and it was a bloodshed. And one of the really famous things that happens from this event is that several people were slaughtered that were completely armless. Several Mexicans began to flee back towards Mexico. The Americans would shoot them, or in particular stab them with bayonets. And the famous thing that they would say is they would shout out, "Me no Alamo, me no Goliad," as in, we were not at this battle, and yet the Americans took that as an opportunity to avenge kill many of the Mexicans instead of taking prisoners of war. Now, what you need to know about this is that Santa Anna surrenders, and if you will highlight, gives them all the land to the Rio Grande. Now, this is heavily disputed by Mexico. Mexico says Santa Anna had no authority to do so, and Texas becomes recognized by the United States, but is declared a rebellious state of Mexico. So we're going to stop there. We will pick this up next Thursday, and next class period.